Well, we've had more threats thrown from Beijing this weekend. This time, their foreign ministry spokesperson has accused Australian politicians of colluding with terrorists in Xinjiang and warned that Canberra will get burned, their words, if it backs those who claim that the Uyghur community is being tortured. Now, this comes after a week of pressure and protest on the federal government to tear up more deals with the Chinese, which give them unprecedented control, in particular of two of our ports, Newcastle and Darwin. Well, tonight we'll hear about another port which has landed in the hands of a Chinese consortium. And there are various airstrips in the west which have been taken over by the Chinese series of companies as well, which have connections to the Communist Party. And to take us through these issues, I'm joined now by Australian businessman Andrew Phelan, who's worked extensively in China and was once contracted to train staff at DFAT in China. Now, Andrew, thank you very much for your time.
Good to be with you again, Chris.
Canberra will be burned if we collude with terrorists. They have no credibility on the subject of torturing the Uyghur minority, have they?
No, it's a ridiculous assertion. And what it shows is that this issue is kind of the Tiananmen Square massacre of 2021. It's super sensitive, particularly with the Winter Olympics, a bit over a year away. So China's mounted a propaganda campaign worldwide of denying what's gone on. And it was really, I got to say, it's really sad to see last week at the National Press Club, Professor Golly sat in front of the National Press Club referring to one anonymous article debunking what she called the dominant narrative with regard to Xinjiang. Now, Xinjiang, if you look at a map of China, it's called the Xinjiang Zhishu, which means the autonomous region. And Xin in Chinese means new, Jiang means border or frontier. So this was a frontier region that became, part of China, a few hundred years ago. But there is no inclination by any Australian politician to suggest that Xinjiang is not part of China or should be separated apart of China. And the suggestion that that's the case is ridiculous.
Do you think on this issue that the US will go through with a possible boycotting of the Chinese Olympic Games next year?
It's certainly being hotly debated. Chris Fenton has a new book out called Feeding the Dragon, which is about Hollywood's relationship and the NBA's relationship with China. And what he's saying is that we should, if the Winter Olympics is going to go ahead, then the West ought to use this event to put pressure, to use it as leverage, to put pressure on China, to say, for example, why don't you let the foreign press have free access and Australia's diplomats have free access to Xinjiang, not staged events where they see shiny, happy Uyghurs holding hands and dancing for the cameras, but free and open access to go into Xinjiang and see what's going to happen. Now, the Chinese government's not going to allow that to happen. My view is that we shouldn't participate in the Winter Olympics, but that's for other people to decide.
OK, let's talk about ports. Most of the conversation has been about the Darwin port, the Port of Darwin, the Port of Newcastle, which, of course, is a crucial exporting hub for coal and other resources. But they're not the only two ports that a Chinese company with connections to the Communist Party have their dibs on. We've got Melbourne with a Chinese company that owns a large percentage of that area.
Yeah. So first, let's make the point that we often talk about trade. We talk about trade in isolation. We shouldn't do that. That's a no-no. We should talk about trade and investment because they're two separate issues, but they're joined at the hip. We've sold a lot of commodities to China, and China thinks, well, you've done pretty well out of us. You should allow us access to invest, with a great deal of freedom into Australia. The issue is, are these investments in what we would call critical infrastructure that are the backbone of our sovereignty and our independence? And when that is the case, they should be looked at. The Port of Darwin deal back in 2015 begged belief, to be quite frank. It's our only deep water port on our northern coast, right? The Port of Newcastle, it's the biggest port on the east coast. It's the largest coal exporting port in the world. It's a little ironic that China's since banned Australian coal after making that investment. And then, of course, there's the Port of Melbourne, which CIC, China Sovereign Wealth Fund, has 20% of it's part of a consortium.
Yeah.
Was sold for $9.7 billion by the Victorian state government. Yep.
Andrew, Scott Morrison said on Friday, I have no evidence
Yep.
of national security risk with any of these companies at any of these ports. But that's not the point, is it?
Yeah. Well, the way it's know thy enemy, know thyself, as the art of war would say. It's important to understand the way China goes about it. And there's a nexus between state-owned enterprises, the CCP, and the PLA. To look at the Port of Darwin port, for example, it was discovered that Landbridge, the operator, has very close relationships with the PLA. And what happens, to use another example, the Port of Piraeus in Greece, a Chinese state-owned shipping company and port operator was able to access 200+ million euros at easy finance to buy that port. So underlying this, to take a step back, is a doctrine called controlling the seas in the region, leaping across the ocean for force protection. It's part of China's maritime Silk Road, part of Belt and Road. And what it means is, of course, if you project to the future, and some of these deals are 99-year leases, if you project to the future and say, well, what if there's a war? Then the logistics to support naval operations become critical.
And can I add?
Yep.
They've also taken control of airstrips in WA, right? Which another...
Yeah, there's a couple over there. I don't think that's as big a deal, but I would put them under that category of critical infrastructure.
Okay, one last one.
Meriden in WA was sold to China Southern Airlines in '95 to train pilots. And China had a legitimate shortage of pilots, so they need them trained. We also train the Singapore Air Force in WA as well.
And coincidentally,
is there a need
Andrew,
to sell the airport itself on a 99-year lease?
Yeah.
Might have seemed like innocuous enough back then, but the world has changed, and I think these deals should not go ahead.
And coincidentally, the Sunday Times in London today did an investigation on the influence of Chinese companies in Britain. 200 British companies are controlled by Chinese investors, and some of them are key installations as well.
Yeah, well, when David Cameron was Prime Minister, they talked about a golden era in Sino-British relations. And Xi Jinping was fawned on when he visited the House of Parliament. But as Professor Seng from the School of Oriental Studies said, they really didn't know what they're dealing with, and they didn't. And so China has a massive footprint in the UK now. To some degree, the horse is bolted. Yeah. The issue remains around critical infrastructure and having a majority stake in critical infrastructure. Yep. Because it enables China, if it wanted to shut that down. And interestingly, last week, the great state of Texas passed legislation to say no investment in critical infrastructure from China, Russia, Iran, or North Korea. Yeah, we could do worse than adopt that, which has been adopted in Texas. I've got to leave it there. Andrew, 100%.
100%. Andrew Phelan, thank you very much for your time.
Cheers, Chris. See ya.
Okay.